Hi everyone, I hope you are doing well. I hate that we can't be in-person class, but I figure we will make the most of the circumstances that we have. So each week I will be putting up some videos that cover our chapters, go over the classwork notes that you need, anything that will be helpful to build up to your papers and then ultimately to the final exam. So this is the first video I'm showing you, so bear with me. I should not have any audio issues, but you never can tell. Technology is a fun thing. But I'll go ahead and get started. Do keep in mind, of course, you're welcome to pause the video, come back to it, anything that you need. This is intended to be something that covers you for this whole week, the 23rd through the 27th. So if you need to, reopen it, if you need to restart it, whatever the case may be, this will be here for you. So I want to definitely cover Chapter 6 today. And Chapter 6, I went ahead and had notes under March 13th, and then of course our courses got canceled. So I wanted to go back to that in case you didn't have a chance to look at those notes. So Chapter 6 is all about justifying your position. And when you think about creating an argument, you need to come across as reasonable, as credible, as keeping your reader's best interests in mind, and that comes from a solid claim or thesis and also making sure that you have strong support. So I'm going to go through the different strategies of Chapter 6 and give you some examples because this will tie into your classwork assignments. And so I'll note those classwork assignments clearly. Just as a heads up, anything that I name as classwork assignment 1 or classwork assignment 2, those will be due in the Dropbox under week 11 in Canvas, titled Chapter 6 and Overall Assignments. You'll see a due date there of March 27th, which is Friday by 11:59 p.m. And then we also do have a quiz this week, but things are very unconventional right now. So your quiz is technically open book, is technically open notes, whatever you need, and it would be uploaded whenever you finish with that to the Dropbox titled Overall Quiz. But I'll give you some more ins and outs of that as we come to it. So let's talk about Chapter 6. Chapter 6, Justify Your Position. One of the first things that you'll need to do when you're creating an argument is to be able to figure out your exact position and your purpose. So the position is your exact stance. What are you for? What are you against? How do you feel about issues such as the death penalty or stem cell research or something that we'll talk about a little bit later, which is mandatory military service? So how do you feel exactly about this issue? That's where your argument starts to come from. How you make that more specific is important, and that's where purpose comes into play. So you may say, oh, I'm for this, I'm against this. That's great. However, you want your thesis or your claim to be specific enough that the person reading your argument could see how the paper is going to be structured, what kinds of evidence you may use, and so forth. So this is where we get into our different purposes. And I wanted to break those down a little bit more because this is key for your next paper. So your next paper is a position essay, which we'll talk about in a lot of detail shortly. And for this essay, you will need to use one of these purpose types. You could probably combine them, but you need to be aware of what distinguishes one from the other. So let's start with supporting or condemning. Supporting or condemning, your thesis basically is saying that something is or is not a good idea. So let's take the issue of mandatory military service. Okay, it's been proposed in the past that everyone in the United States, once they turn 18, man or woman, should have to serve a certain amount of time in the military and that it comes with certain benefits. So let's say that if you have that issue of mandatory military service and you want to say, well, I'm pro that. So a supporting or condemning thesis would say something like, mandatory military service would be in the best interests of both each adult and the country as a whole. So when you're doing supporting or condemning, you have a clear-cut pro or con stance, but it's not just yes, this should happen, or no, this should not happen. There needs to be a little bit more to it than that. And that's the example that I gave you. So, supporting or condemning, you're basically saying this is or isn't a good idea. Let's move next to our fixing thesis. So, this is where you discuss what is wrong with the thinking about an issue. So, in your mind, people see this issue in a wrong way. Maybe they overestimate something, or maybe they oversimplify something. So, let's take, for example, our mandatory military service topic. So, if we want to do a fixing thesis with that, we may say something like, when people think of mandatory military service, they wrongly believe that it strips people of human rights. Okay? Obviously, I think that you would probably have an issue with creating a paper off of that thesis alone. I think you would need to broaden it, but that would be your starting off point. So, what you're saying with this issue is, I think it's wrong that people see mandatory military service as anti-human rights. Okay? And you can kind of branch off from there and say, okay, well, how can I make that bigger for this paper that's 3.5 to 4 pages? So we've started with our supporting or condemning purpose and talked about how that's more of a pro-con stance, just a little more specific though, where you say this is or is not a good idea. A fixing thesis is where you address what's wrong with how people think about an issue. Please keep these things in mind. I promise you there will be a question on the final exam that ties into these, and you'll need to know the differences among them. Next, we get into choosing a side. Choosing a side is more so than supporting or condemning, is really the most simple, I'm pro this or I'm against this. So the supporting or condemning, saying this is or isn't a good idea, that's a little bit more nuanced. It's, I am for this because of A, B, and C. Fixing, as we talked about, this is what's wrong with how people think about the issue. Choosing a side, you could start with something very basic, such as mandatory military service should be enacted in the United States. I would hope that for your final paper, you might make it a little bit more precise, but that would be a good working starting thesis for a paper where your purpose is choosing a side. And of course, a choosing a side thesis, no one's going to mistake how you feel about this. You feel very firmly, very strongly one way or another. Okay, so we've talked about these first 3 thesis statements types, and I keep saying thesis statement or claim types. So the purpose that you pick will directly affect what your thesis or claim looks like. Let's go next to warning, and you'll see here I've got this set up so that you can kind of go with me with my notes, and there's a copy of this also under week 9 with March 13 notes, so you can reference this as well there. So let's talk about warning. The warning purpose would say that something bad is going to happen regarding this issue. Okay? So let's go back to that topic of mandatory military service. For a warning thesis, I might say something like, if the U.S. does not implement mandatory military service, the military in the future will be weak. Okay? That, of course, is a starting point. I purposely didn't write down these beautiful thesis statements to talk about with you because thinking of thesis statements is this kind of free-flowing, relatively informal process where you're constantly saying, how can I make this more streamlined, better, more precise? So you're hearing me just kind of spitballing, so to speak. So warning is something bad will happen with regards to this issue, if we do something with it or if we don't do something with it, okay? And then proposing. Proposing is, in effect, saying there's a better way to do something, okay? So you might say for this topic of mandatory military service, you might say something like, as a starting off point, the current U.S. method of voluntary military service is insufficient to meet our needs, so mandatory service is required. So you're basically saying the current way of doing something is not good. And I would assume through your paper you would not only talk about what's not good about it, but also how do we fix it. Okay? And I'm going to tie back and reiterate some things with these thesis statements. Again, I feel like, obviously this is the most you hear my voice. I like to have conversations with you. That is not as possible now because our servers everywhere, I don't think, can take a lot of these Zoom videos and things. So pardon me for hearing my voice a ton, but I want to make sure that you get all the materials you need. But after looking at this, if you still feel stuck on something, let me know. I will be glad to take your questions anytime and help you out with that. So we talked about proposing. Let's close out with transforming. A transforming thesis statement it talks about how there's a flaw in the way that we do things. So this is different from fixing. Fixing is there's something wrong with the way we think about something. Transforming is there's something wrong with the way we do something. It's very similar to proposing, but transforming doesn't have to offer solutions. Okay, so I'll break that back down again momentarily. So transforming thesis statement might just say something like the current way that we approach the military with voluntary service is not sufficient to meet the U.S.'s needs. Something like that would work as a transforming thesis. So let's go back and talk about these purposes. Just a little recap, Cliff's Notes. Supporting or condemning. That type of thesis or that type of purpose basically says that something is or is not a good idea. Okay? A fixing thesis says that there's something wrong with the way that we think about a particular issue. Choosing a side is that kind of classic pro-con argument, saying I am for this, I am against this. You're taking a clear-cut position. A warning purpose or thesis says that if we don't do something or we do something regarding an issue, something bad will happen. Proposing says that there's a better way of doing things with this issue. And then transforming is there's something wrong with the way something is done with this issue. Okay? So there's a lot of different angles you can take with an argument, and I wanted to talk about these really fully, not just for the sake of your position argument papers, but because this makes your arguments fresher. If you're always choosing a side purpose or thesis, your arguments can feel a little stale after a while, and we definitely don't want that. So that brings me, though, to our first classwork assignment. I'm going to be giving you 3 total classwork assignments through this video, and the first one ties into this topic, so I distribute these throughout. That way you don't have a lot of things hitting you at once, but I'll do a recap at the end. So this will be the first thing that's part of the file that you upload to the Dropbox titled Chapter 6 and Overall Assignments. So what I'm asking you to do is to take these 6 different purposes and create 6 different thesis statements with the topic mandatory vaccinations. Okay, mandatory vaccinations. What I mean by that is there's been a proposal out there that every child should have a set of their vaccinations up to a certain age, that the federal government should mandate that. There are some people who disagree with that idea. They feel like it should be the parent's decision if a child is vaccinated for certain things like chicken pox or measles, things of that nature. So your topic is mandatory vaccinations. Please give me 6 different thesis statements. 1 that is supporting or condemning, 1 that is fixing, 1 that is choosing a side, 1 that is warning, 1 that is proposing, and 1 that is transforming. So this first classwork assignment should be a total of 6 sentences. Okay? Let's talk about the rest of these strategies and kind of discuss those for a little bit. And then I want to talk a little bit more about your paper and a classwork assignment that's going to help, I think, reconfigure the way that we think about argument, that it's not just always a claim with reason. Sometimes rebuttal takes center stage. So we've talked about extensively the first strategy, adopt a position and purpose. So once you've decided what your issue is you want to argue about, think about how you feel about it, and then what your thesis purpose is going to be. Which one of the 6, or maybe even a combination of 2 of the 6 you're going to do for your thesis statement. Next, you will need to make sure and figure out your evidence. This means that you go ahead and do some initial research. Go to Galileo, go to Google Scholar, go to any of those resources in our library page in Scholar, and think about what your needs are. You're going to need expert opinion. You're going to need statistics. You're going to need people who are connected to the issue in some key way, commenting on it. And you're going to need to look for multiple positions on the issue. So if you were talking about mandatory military service and you're pro that, I still would think when you're looking at the evidence, especially for the type of paper you're doing, you would absolutely need to find the opinions of people who disagree with you as well. A good argument includes evidence that shows you are aware that your opinion is not the be-all, end-all, that there are other views out there, and even though they may have accuracy issues or they may be ethically unsound, then you still have this idea, okay, at least I know these opinions are out there. That's the main thing. So after you figured out your thesis, make sure and get some research going. You can always add to your research, see where your gaps are, but at least do some initial searches. And we'll talk about your research needs for this paper. So let's address next the third strategy. Make sure that you are able to state your reasons. So reasons and evidence are 2 different things. Think about your reasons as basically your main points. So if your thesis is mandatory military service should be required in the United States, think about 3 or 4 or 5 reasons why you think that is true. How would that be helpful? Okay. That is where strategy 3 comes into play. And with strategy 2, you want to initially see what kind of viewpoints are out there, what kind of evidence is out there. So if you happen to put strategy 3 before strategy 2, that's fine. That's no big deal because they need to meet up in strategy 4. So number 1, get your thesis together. Number 2, do some initial research. Number 3, why do you feel the way that you do? What's your main points? And then number 4, put your evidence and your main points together. So the reasons that you believe the way that you do, what statistics, what expert opinion, what things have you found that would help back those up? It's not enough to say, I feel like this is true because of A, B, and C. You need reliable sources to show why your opinion is credible and based on up-to-date and logical evidence. Okay. Kind of rounding down with all of this, let's go into the 5th strategy. Any good argument has a rebuttal, I would say, because as I mentioned previously, you need to know that opposing views are out there and you need to be able to address those. You need to be able to talk about why those views are ethical or not, where there might be practical issues with them, are there points that the opposition's overlooking. It makes you a more strong arguer to be able to say what's wrong with others' arguments in, of course, a pleasant way. You can't necessarily just knock people's views down and say that they're foolish. This needs to be a logical equals meeting equals type of rebuttal. So it helps show that you are credible, that you understand the issue broadly, and that you're not worried about someone else's points being better than yours. You're able to easily refute those. I would say the 6th strategy is probably the most difficult. I think that I like to look at strategy 6 as a creative version of strategy 3. Okay? So you have your argument. You know why you feel the way that you do about it. If you're pro or against the death penalty, for example, you know why you feel that way. It's something to do with your sense of justice or finances or any number of things that would back up your viewpoint. But sometimes it's a good idea to think about the less typical reasons. Remember, we did that in your causal argument. I asked you to come up with more creative, less thought about causes or effects with this issue because otherwise people are just reading the same old things over and over again. The same thing goes with your arguments. When you're talking about things like mandatory military service or stem cell research or foreign aid or taxes or school tuition, things of that nature, there are a lot of typical arguments and reasons that people have brought up to back up these issues. If you can find more creative ways, I think that you would garner more respect from your reader because they would say, oh, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I hadn't thought about it in that way. And I think you also keep from feeling like you're hashing over the same tired things over and over and over again. Okay? So I'm going to go through these strategies a bit and talk about how I might put those into play when it comes to a particular issue. And there's going to be a classwork number 2 that ties into what I'm talking about. So please stay tuned a few minutes after for your second classwork assignment. So let's take a topic that I think has kind of been talked about more so 20 years ago than now, but it's still a commonly talked about topic. It's definitely not been settled. And the topics for your paper will need to be currently relevant, so I picked this one because it still has that current relevance. People still talk about it. And that topic is euthanasia. People often call it physician-assisted suicide. This idea that people can, if they are terminally ill, request that a doctor withhold medicine so that they pass away, and that would be referred to as passive euthanasia, or they can request that a doctor introduce something in their system that would hasten their death. So an overdose of morphine, for example, and that would be active euthanasia. Euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide is currently only legal in Oregon, and outside of America, there's a couple of other countries that permit it, but it is not legal in the United States with the exception of Oregon. Some people have pushed for this to be the case, that people should be permitted to decide their end of life whenever they are particularly sick if there's no hope, okay? So that's your context for euthanasia. So I'm going to talk about common reasons to support the claim and some opposing reasons and talk about refuting those. So I'm going to kind of go through these strategies in a slightly informal way. That will pave the way for your classwork assignment. Okay? So let's talk about euthanasia. I'm just going to arbitrarily take a pro stance. Okay? So I'm going to argue that physician-assisted suicide should be legal with particular guidelines in all 50 states. Okay? So let's talk about, that's my claim, that's my thesis right there. Let's talk about some of the reasons that I would use to support that claim. Okay? One reason I might give to support that claim is that when someone is terminally ill and there is no hope, they need a professional to help them. Okay? So one of my reasons for saying that euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide should be permitted is because people should not be allowed to linger in pain. They need a professional to help them when there's no hope left. Okay? Let's say another reason that I give is that physician-assisted suicide should be legal in all 50 states because it might prevent more painful suicides. So if someone is terminally ill and feels like there's no hope and does not want to go forward, that person might be inclined to do something to end their lives, or maybe get a friend or a family member to do that. And I might be arguing then that with them not being a medical professional, they could grievously just injure themselves, or they might suffer some excruciating, painful death. Okay, so far, here's what we've got. The claim is that physician-assisted suicide, also referred to as euthanasia, should be legal in all 50 states. For one, people with no hope for recovery from a terminal illness should be given the decision to end their lives by a professional. Another reason is having a medical professional assist in this will hopefully prevent painful or botched suicides. Okay. So let's talk about the opposition. Okay. So the opposition would definitely say, for example, that it is wrong to put physicians in the position to take life, because that is not their role. If you think about the Hippocratic Oath, it is first do no harm. So someone who opposes that stance on euthanasia, on physician-assisted suicide, would say physicians should not be put in the position to do harm. Okay? So if you are refuting that statement, if you put that in, here's what the opposition says, let me reinforce that, or let me talk about where that's incorrect, I might point to the idea that we have do not resuscitate orders already in place. If people are gravely ill, if they know that their death is coming, they can, just like you would a will, fill out paperwork with a do not resuscitate order. So if they go into cardiac arrest, or if they suffer some medical distress, the doctors in the emergency room in the hospital are not to resuscitate them. That's the patient's decision. So I might say, to refute this idea that we shouldn't put those physicians in that position, I might say, well, one key part of their job is already in that fashion of euthanasia, where they are letting people pass if the patient has that on his or her paperwork. Okay? So far we've talked about the thesis or the claim. We've talked about a couple reasons to back it up. And we've also talked about one opposition point and how to refute that. I want to go next to these reasons within reasons, or basically a lesser known reason to back up the claim. Okay? So if my stance in this argument paper is that euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide should be allowed in all 50 states, what I might have as a reason that people don't talk about much anymore is this idea of bodily autonomy. Okay? So, for example, in the U.S., it is law that once you die, no one's allowed to take your organs unless you have signed up to be an organ donor. Okay? That's an example of bodily autonomy. In the United States, our firm belief and our constitutional guidelines say that your body is your own to do with what you want to a certain extent. Okay? So I might say that one reason that physician-assisted suicide should be allowed is that it's consistent with bodily autonomy rules that we already have in place. Now, this is a reasoning that may not immediately come to mind. I would think it's a little bit more creative than the standard, so that might be one of my reasons inside reasons. Okay, so let's recap for just a moment. Pardon me, I'm having to sip water through this. I don't have your lovely voices coming in to chime in and add to the discussion, ask questions, which I very much miss. So it's just me here quietly at home. So pardon me for just a moment. So let's recap what I've done here. So I talked about my claim is that euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide should be permitted in all 50 states. One reason for that ties into the need to have a medical professional assist with end-of-life decisions. Another reason would be that it would prevent painful or botched suicides. And then a third reason would be that it's consistent with bodily autonomy laws and rules we already have in the U.S. I would also note that people might be opposed to this because they feel like this is putting the physician in a position of harming. And I would refute that by saying, no, physicians have to deal with things like DNR requests. Therefore, they are already in that position to end life most of the time passively. Okay? So I'm doing a little paper planning here. I'm doing a little argument planning. That brings me to classwork assignment number 2. So your first one was to create those 6 different thesis statements and tie into those 6 different purposes, okay, using the topic of mandatory got a little tongue-tied, mandatory vaccines. So let's go with classwork assignment number 2. I would like for you to take the topic of gun control. Your stance can be whatever you like, does not matter to me. I want you to first give me a claim. Okay? Next, give me one reason to support that claim that you feel like a lot of people are aware of. Next, give me a more creative reason inside reason. What's a point that would support your claim that might not be as talked about, that might be a little bit more creative? Finally, note what someone who is opposed to your argument would say and why you feel like that opposition view is illogical, unethical, just plain wrong. Okay? So just to recap, I need a sentence for your claim, a sentence for reason number 1, a sentence for reason number 2, your more creative reason, and I would say 3-4 sentences for your opposition statement and your rebuttal of that. Okay? So far, we've got 2 classwork assignments under our belts. I definitely want to make sure that we talk more about this paper that's coming up due. If you saw my messages in Canvas, hopefully everybody has seen those, good to go. Then you know that the position paper, the position argument is now due Friday, April 3rd. Okay? And that is due by 11:59 p.m. to the Dropbox. I am very glad to look at any rough drafts through the end of day, Thursday, April 2nd. Since I can't really go much of anywhere, I'm glad to have those emails come in pretty late, so no worries there. I would say topics, send those to me through this week. I just want to make sure you're on the right track with what you're doing. I want to make sure that I can answer any of your questions, so please get in touch. Text me, call me, email me, anything that you need. So let's talk a little bit about this position paper more in detail. So you've got a lot of resources under week 9 for your reference. I've got several sample papers that were wonderful, and I do have some guidelines there. I have some topic ideas, so you've got a number of things to work with there. Okay? And with this essay, we're doing something a little bit less typical. So a position argument is usually, I feel this way about a topic, here's my reasons, they're supported, here's a conclusion. So that's a typical traditional position argument. Your position argument will be all based around a series of rebuttals. So let me explain what I mean by that. So first off, you will need to pick a currently relevant topic. I've got a huge topic list under week 9 in Canvas, so please take a look at that. You can work off of that topic list, whatever works for you, as long as it's an issue that's still talked about, okay? So first, pick your topic. It needs to be something that has been argued about fairly recently, that's still relevant, that has not been settled. So anything where there's a new law in place, where people are starting to agree on it, probably not one to touch, okay? So let's start with that. You start with your topic, you start with your position on that topic. Next, I'm going to be asking you to organize your essay in a rebuttal structure. So instead of the main points being your reasons why your ideas are true, each one of your main points is going to start with an opposition statement. This is why XYZ person disagrees with this stance, and this is why that person's ideas are incorrect. So let me show you this outline that I've got here for your reference. And I just did one on a pretty easy topic, the death penalty. And of course, you are very welcome to work on the death penalty. It's still being argued about, so you're fine with that. So I want to talk about how this paper looks, because that's the key thing. Your organization, your points need to look a very particular way, and those samples that I've got for you under week 9 are on point. I would definitely recommend those, okay? So let's start with our thesis. The thesis here is that the death penalty should be abolished in all states due to its serious ethical and practical concerns. So, of course, we're looking at this, and the idea being that you've taken a clear stance against the death penalty. So I know exactly where you feel about this issue. So the death penalty should be abolished due to its serious ethical and practical concerns. So instead of here's reasons A, B, and C why this is true, you're going to start each main point by talking about the people who disagree with you, the people who support the death penalty, okay? The key is here, you need to find those viewpoints through research. You can't just say, oh, the people who support the death penalty, I think they support it because of this reason, and then this is why they're wrong. That's called creating a straw man argument, where you just make up opposition points that are really easy to knock down. You knock them down, and you look like a hero. But the goal here is to actually find people who have said these things and then to talk about why they're incorrect. So your paper is saying that the death penalty is wrong. Your main points, let's start with main point 1. According to, find a person or group who is pro-death penalty, and main point 1 will talk about that viewpoint. So according to whoever this person or group may be, those who support the death penalty see it as appropriate justice for particularly brutal crimes, crimes involving children, and multiple murders. So you're going to start off main point 1 by saying, okay, the people who are pro the death penalty, this is one reason why they are, because they feel like it is justice for certain types of crimes, okay? Immediately after you name that viewpoint and explain it as much as you see fit, then you talk about what is problematic with that viewpoint. So I've put here, however, this viewpoint has some issues. Okay, so you might talk about how, in a certain moral sense, that the death penalty is eye for an eye, and that may be an issue when you think about a biblical standpoint, or you think about what it means to have revenge. So you might say, it's understandable people would want this kind of justice. However, there's problems with this stance, okay? So each main point should look like this. The person or people who disagree with your stance, what's one reason why they would disagree? And then how would you say that one of their stances is problematic in some way? Think about how it's ethically problematic. Think about how it's logically problematic. Think about ideas that they have overlooked, okay? The structure is everything. You're feeling like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. I feel like I'm not getting this together. Double, triple, quadruple check over those samples. Look back at this outline that I've got here that's also posted under week 9 as March 13 notes. Look at it again, and get in touch with any questions that you've got for me, okay? So just keep in mind that each main point is, here's an opposition view, here's why it's wrong. Here's an opposition view, here's why it's wrong, okay? I wanted to talk a little bit about the final thing that's going on for this week, and that is the overall essay. Christine Overall's work, Think Before You Breed. I think even if you haven't even looked at this essay, the title should tell you everything. She wants you to think long and hard before having kids. She is worried that people are having children for the wrong reason. She points to some very popular families in the public eye who have a lot of children and finds those groups problematic. So she's definitely saying, think through heavily your decision to have children. Of course, her argument is one that has been talked about So many times over, people thinking about why should you have children? Why should you not have children? All these types of things. So I want you to engage with her work in two ways, okay? So this brings me to classwork assignment number 3. I want you to take one of the main points that overall talks about. It could be small, it could be large, something that she says, and give a rebuttal of it. So just give me, in paragraph 3, overall says this. However, this viewpoint is problematic because of A, B, and C. I would say a total of like 4 or 5 sentences for that would be perfect. Okay, so that's classwork assignment number 3. I'm going to do a big recap at the end so you know what the expectation is for the work and you're good to go. But of course, you can always get in touch with any questions that you have. Finally, you do have a quiz this week. So typically when we read overall in class, I do a quiz where I ask some reading comprehension questions, and it's closed book and closed notes. We are obviously not in a position to do that now without things being a little painful or odd or awkward. So this is, of course, open book. It's completely fine. If you look under week 11, you will see a drop box titled Overall Quiz. You'll also see a file that is named Overall Quiz English 1020, also under week 11. And if you'll open that document, follow the directions on that quiz, and upload the final document to the quiz Dropbox, you are good to go. Okay? So let's talk about this, pull it all together, recap everything. I wish I was in person to talk about this with you. Unfortunately, I'm not, but please really do take me up on it. Text me, call me, email me, 8 to 6, Monday through Friday. Weekends, I may be a little back and forth, but I will be glad to talk to you anytime. Paper questions, homework questions, if you just want to vent because you are tired of seeing your same 2 family members, whatever you need, I got you, okay? So let's do a recap of what we've talked about with the assignments so that you've got that on hand. So classwork assignment number 1, I asked you to create 6 different thesis statements with the 6 different purposes under strategy 1 of chapter 6. And your topic is mandatory vaccinations. Okay, so 6 sentences for that. Classwork assignment number 2, I asked you to take the topic of gun control, create a thesis about it that clearly states your stance, give me 1 typical reason to support your stance. 1 sentence is good. Give me a more creative reason to support your stance. Again, 1 sentence is good. And then give me an oppositional view. What is something that someone would say against your thesis, and why is this person not correct? So 3 or 4 sentences for that. So I'm looking for a total of 6 to 7 sentences for classwork assignment number 2. So 6 sentences for number 1. For number 2, 6 to 7 sentences. And then classwork assignment number 3, read Christine Overall's Think Before You Breed. Take one of her main points and give a rebuttal. Where does this point not hold up? Ethically, logically, any of those types of things. So that should be a total of about 4 to 5 sentences. And then last but not least, you have your quiz on overall. Upload that to the separate Dropbox. So classwork assignments 1, 2, and 3, the thesis statements, the gun control, the overall rebuttal, those should go in the Dropbox all together, titled Chapter 6 and Overall Assignments. The quiz should go in the separate quiz Dropbox. But when in doubt, let me know if any of this you think, ooh, I need to clarify. Obviously, I know there's some disadvantages to distantly communicating things, so I'm glad to help. There's no way you can bother me. You can ask me 100 questions, and that is no problem whatsoever. But that will wrap up for this week's lecture, And what I will be doing next week is talking about Chapter 7. Chapter 7 is going to deal with how we use language and how it's really important to choose your words carefully. And I'm so sad we're not in person class to talk about this chapter. It's one of my favorites. And we're also going to be talking about 2 readings, The Third World by John McCormick and Joel Cotkins, Our Millennials, the Screw Generation. So those are 2 readings also in your textbook. And of course, please don't forget that not this Friday, the 27th, but next Friday, April 3rd, your position essay is due, and I will look at drafts and look at intros and anything that you need. So just let me know how I can assist, and I will be plugged in so I can help you with anything that might be helpful. All right, so have a good week. Let me know how I can help, and I will hopefully see you all, or at the very least talk to you all soon.